Hello, Argent here. So a couple people have requested me to do character profiles of American revolutionary figures, founding fathers, if you will. So I figured why not start with the father of the nation himself, George Washington. Now it may come to a surprise to some people and probably not to others. I've always been a fan of Washington. It's something that hasn't really changed over time, even as kind of my political views have altered. I've always had a lot of time for George Washington. Kind of a bit like Napoleon, I feel he successfully guided his nation through an incredibly difficult time and really did a good job, especially considering the immense difficulties he had to deal with. So I guess the first thing is to talk about kind of the revolution itself. I've never thought the term revolution really was a good one. They never really overthrew the British government. They didn't go to Britain and overthrow the king. It was kind of, I think, a war of independence would be better. Or I suppose you could even call it a civil war. The American Civil War, First American Civil War. Because it was basically British colonists versus the British in London. In the past, I've called it Philadelphia versus London, because Philadelphia was the capital of America at the time. So a lot of people really, particularly kind of in these circles, really hate America. They view it as a revolutionary country who betrayed their monarch, who betrayed tradition and set up a degenerate democratic republic. Now, to a certain extent, I guess there's some kind of very surface level truth to that. But America is in a lot of ways a more traditional country than Britain is. I don't think that's really arguable. America is a much more religious country. America values personal freedom a lot more. Americans still have their guns. America, whenever it's lost any of its liberty in the modern era, it normally comes from the Supreme Court or by, I guess, kind of some kind of underhanded thing, and it's often amidst immense public opposition. So, given that, I generally speaking support the American Revolution. I know in my country, not being part of America didn't really do us any good. We were loyal to the crown, and it brought us an extremely degenerate kind of Sodom and Gomorrah type of country. America certainly has a lot of problems, but I tend to think there is at least a large, healthy population that opposes the bad things that are happening, in contrast to a lot of other places. So that being said, let's start out with George Washington. So George Washington was a Virginia aristocrat. The southern United States was probably, from what I can recall in school, the most like Great Britain. The South had a landed aristocracy. That's probably because it was a lot more rural than the North. Northern America has, generally speaking, been a lot more urban. It had a lot more factories, especially after America became a country. That was kind of part of the reason the North stomped the South so hard during the Civil War, was the North possessed all these factories. They could make a lot more cannons. They could make a lot more muskets, etc. So due to kind of the rural nature of the South, you had a landed aristocracy. George Washington's family was one of those. So my understanding is George Washington was mainly from gentry. He was, I guess, what you'd call maybe middle class. Definitely from kind of like noble blood, but not really upper noble blood, if that makes sense. I think he was referred to as being middling rank. So he came from a fairly wealthy family in a plantation. The first thing, I guess, where we kind of see George Washington enter the historical record was he was a surveyor. He surveyed a lot of Western Virginia, which was a well-paying job, and he used a great deal of his family's money to purchase land in Western Virginia and the Shenandoah Valley. Because he surveyed it, so he kind of got the first dibs on the best land. He knew which pieces were good to buy and which weren't, and it would be a source of wealth throughout his life despite trouble with squatters and Indians. So George Washington left that. I think it should be around this time be important to note. George Washington was 6'2", and which is really high, especially back then, before kind of modern nutrition. He also was a very strong man, but he was a man who suffered continually from ill health. He had smallpox, he had tuberculosis, he had extremely bad teeth problems. From what people say, I think his teeth problems were caused by, I think it's like mercury oxide. It's something they used to treat malaria with, but it rots your teeth extremely quick. Now, I think what's kind of important to note during this part in time is it's widely believed that George Washington was infertile. That's the reason he never had children, not that he and his wife didn't get along. Which I think kind of makes sense. He had a lot of different illnesses. From what I've seen about smallpox and tuberculosis, I think there is a decent chance, like a 5% chance or whatever, that it can render you infertile. So it's certainly believed that George Washington was infertile, and I think that'll become important later. So George Washington went from being a surveyor to joining the army. That's kind of what aristocrats did back in the day. Aristocrats were expected to serve in the army, mainly as officers. They were expected to do a lot of different things. It was a different era. Aristocrats kind of justified their wealth by patronizing the arts and sciences, doing charitable work, and by serving in the country's armed forces. They were kind of expected to lead by example. So George Washington joined the Virginia militia. Initially, I think as a captain or a major. He was eventually promoted to colonel and was the head of, unless I'm not mistaken, he was the head of the Virginia militia. So George Washington fought during the French and Indian War, which was quite, from my understanding, he was noted for his bravery and calm under fire. George Washington, as a general, would frequently lead from the front, and he was infamous for having, I think it was 6 or 7 horses shot from under him. There's a quote attributed to him that was something to the effect of, "The most invigorating feeling in the world is for bullets to fly past you and to remain completely unharmed." So he would always campaign and share the hardships of his troops, and was quite willing to face death down, and this was evident from his militia days. He also learned a lot about the professional British Army from this period that he would later use later on in life. So he married Martha, or I guess Martha Washington, who was a wealthy widow. He raised the 2 children from a previous marriage, but they never had children together because he was infertile. So, around this time we start to have a lot of various events happening. This is at the height of the Enlightenment having ended with the French Revolution. So we have all these liberal thinkers. We have Voltaire, we have Rousseau, we have John Locke. We have all these different thinkers who are beginning to kind of conceptualize modern political thought as we know it. Concepts like the rule of law, I mean, that's kind of existed in Britain for a long time, but it's starting to kind of spread out and become a formalized ideology. The idea that kings should not be absolute, that kings are subject to the general will. There's this increasing idea that government should be representative of the people and the people should have a say in government. Like I said, rule of law, basic human rights. All that sort of things were kind of coming to a head during this period. And Britain is kind of interesting because Britain had always kind of, I guess you could say, been progressive on these issues. It's not necessarily that Britain was a more liberal, as we understand it today, country. It's just kind of the British culture. The British have traditionally been a lot more individualistic, a lot more kind of egalitarian, I suppose you could say, than some continental countries. That's not to say Britain didn't have a very strong class system, but even the plebs in Britain had some sense they were owed certain rights as an Englishman. And this translated a great deal to the colonies. So we kind of had a scenario where more and more people were immigrating to the American colonies, and they were growing stronger and stronger relative to Britain. Now, I think to a certain extent this kind of explains why America left in kind of a violent fashion, whereas Canada and Australia and New Zealand didn't. They were much, much smaller and much, much weaker than Britain was. But America was kind of rapidly catching up. Obviously, they were nowhere near the size of Britain, but you had this huge landmass, you had a rapidly growing population, and you had a rapidly growing economy, and they began to feel, well, we should govern ourselves, because we're kind of in this ambiguous scenario. We aren't exactly, we're technically part of Britain. We don't have representation in the House of Commons, though, and we're paying taxes to Great Britain. Now, I will be the first to admit that the whole tax thing was complete bullshit. Do I think it really matters in the long run that kind of some of the reasons for the revolution were the War of Secession were bullshit? No, not really. I do think it's bullshit. I think the whole Boston Tea Party was bullshit. The Americans, I remember in history class, we were taught that they paid a tenth of the taxes that the British paid. And in part, the British had raised the taxes in the colonies to pay for the French-Indian War, which conquered a bunch of territory and secured a lot of the kind of western parts of America at the moment for the colonies. So they were basically paying for a war that was fought on their behalf. So yeah, I think that was kind of bullshit, but I think there was kind of a broader sense that there was a cultural divergence between the two. America still definitely has an Anglo culture, but there was beginning to develop this sense that America was different, that the government in London didn't really understand them anymore, that there was just kind of a different way of life, and just it was better that they should go their separate ways. So this eventually just kind of there's kind of a state of affairs I call the wood keeps getting drier and the sparks keep getting bigger. That means that the circumstances for something to break out keep getting easier. I guess kind of social disorder, etc. Like when we get to World War I, the wood was extremely dry by that point. It got drier over time with each Balkan crisis, with things like the Morocco crisis. Things kept getting more and more to the point where it would be easier to ignite them, and also the sparks kept getting bigger and bigger. That is, the things that could ignite the crisis. So eventually that was ignited and we had the Revolutionary War happen. Now, as a natural-born American, George Washington sided with the Continental Army and the American, I guess you could say, separatists or American revolutionaries. So as one of the highest-ranking American officers in the British Army, he was given command of an army which eventually came to be known as the Continental Army. So George Washington's general strategy in the American Revolution was to basically try to wear the British down. He always had an army in a field, and he was always attacking and doing damage to the British. Obviously, if the British had have thrown their entire back into a war with America, they could have crushed them. But the war was very unpopular in Britain. While they certainly wanted to kind of maintain control of the colonies, there was also a sense of they didn't like killing other Englishmen, because you have this English population, and you're basically raising money to go and kill other Englishmen and to take it over. A lot of them had family in Britain, in the colonies, and it was just unpopular. It was also extremely expensive to send a huge army and to send the Royal Navy, the bulk of it, over to the Americas and to fight there. So it rung up a lot of debt. They had to increase taxes at home. It cut off a lot of luxuries people were importing, and it was just very unpopular, which is part of the reason they had to bring in so many German mercenaries. So George Washington kept an army in the field. He kept hitting the British. Eventually, for the first year or so, it was mainly kind of, I guess you could say, guerrilla attacks, hit and run, what's often called Fabian tactics, after General Fabius, who was able to fight Hannibal to a standstill by preserving his army's strength and fighting smaller battles whenever it favored him. So Washington initially favored Fabian tactics, kind of similar to those of, General Fabius. So over time, though, as the Revolutionary War progressed, the Loyalists kind of declined or fled to Canada, and more of the population started to support the American secession. So more and more people joined the army. He also began to punish deserters more severely. They offered larger salaries and more rewards for being part of the army, and his army continued to grow and grow. Also, there was the addition of French regular soldiers and more guns and ammunition from the French and from capturing British supplies. So they were able to start to have pitched battles. So over time, Washington kind of engineered it so that time was working in America's favor. They were getting stronger and stronger, more and more recruits, and the war is becoming increasingly unpopular in Britain as debt continued to rise, as the people were continually just believing the colonies were more trouble than they were worth. So with French naval support, the Americans were able to, of course, defeat the British, and we had the British withdraw from the Americas and the formation of the United States of America. Now, this is kind of really where we start to see George Washington and why I kind of admire him. Because you have to understand, because a lot of people say, well, they established a republic. He didn't make himself the king of America. It's degeneracy. Now, first off, the main problem, I guess, from the outset is Washington had no heirs. If Washington had declared himself the king of America, what would the succession plan be? Would they elect a new would it be an elective monarchy? I mean, what was going to happen? Plus, I don't think it was stable in the long term, because American society was very divided. You had the Federalists at one point who wanted society to kind of remain like Britain. They wanted a very limited franchise, only kind of property owning white males. It eventually eventually universal white male suffrage was established. But they wanted property requirements. They wanted a strong federal government. They just had a general distrust of liberalism, the Enlightenment thought, and mass democracy. On the other hand, though, you had Jefferson and his followers who wanted radicalism. They basically were kind of similar to the Jacobins in a lot of ways. I guess more decentralized, though. They wanted America to imitate French continental philosophy. They wanted more democracy, more direct rule by the people, etc. So Washington was thrust into this deeply divided government, and he was forced to make a lot of hard decisions. So what Washington essentially decided was America, he was going to try and take a lot of the governance and kind of the national character of America out of the hands of kind of democracy, and he advocated a very strong constitution. And so we get to the American Constitution, which is hated by a lot of people in these spheres who view it as degenerate modernism. Now, it should be noted that the Constitution has lasted longer than most other forms of government. We have France, who's on like the sixth republic. I think it's like the sixth republic, second empire, third or fourth kingdom. They've been through like over a dozen governments in 200 years. We have Latin American countries where they rewrite the Constitution every decade or so, and they switch from civilian to military government on a dime. We've had all sorts of countries that just go through constitutions and forms of government like people change clothes. America's kept the same form of government, and it's been relatively stable for over 200 years, which I think is impressive. And the Constitution has become traditional to America. It's not like just some piece of paper that they scribble in France every 20 years. People believe in it with kind of a religious fervor. People believe that it is divinely ordained. It's become the national myth. And I don't mean myth in terms of it being untrue or something. Don't get me wrong. I mean it is a core part of how Americans see themselves. They're kind of, to a large extent, defined by the Constitution, and American identity is loyalty and enforcement of the Constitution. In a lot of ways, the Constitution, I think, is a pretty solid document. The issue is the Constitution needs to be in the context of a limited government in a society that's mostly white males. And it worked very well, generally speaking, during that period. But now that we have all this diversity as our strength and stuff, it's kind of fallen out of favor. But people are still en masse willing to fight and die for the Constitution. It's still held in this kind of reverence in a way that, in my view, is a lot similar to how people used to hold monarchs and monarchies. So to a certain extent, you can kind of argue that America has this different traditionalism, but people are as loyal or more loyal to the Constitution than they are to the Queen. I know in Canada there's very little loyalty to the Queen. It's incomparable how much more Americans believe in the Constitution and the sacredness of it than we believe in our monarchy here. So George Washington wanted a strong Constitution. He wanted a powerful federal government. Now keep in mind, compared to kind of what we have here today, it's not even like vaguely close. By a strong federal government, he meant it had some ability to raise an army, that it would have an army, that it would conduct foreign relations, that it would conduct trade, that it would be able to make investments in the economy, that sort of thing. Not like this all-powerful, massive thing we have today where it's like 40% of the GDP. That's not what he meant, but he felt that you can't just have parts of the country de facto seceding every other week. We can't just have, every time a tax is passed, a bunch of people rise up and start shooting. You do need some sort of central government. You need a strong executive, etc. So the American system of government he set up was a balance of federal and state power. The federal government was still weaker than the states, but it was able to stand up to them to a certain extent. And Washington undertook, so he developed that, he developed a strong balance of powers, etc. So Washington, that was kind of his attempt to kind of reconcile the two sides. You had a lot of power taken out of the people's hands, and by people I mean the masses, through the rule of law, through different institutions that kind of competed against each other. The president counterbalanced Congress. You had a bunch of senators were, I believe, initially elected by the states. Yes, senators were elected by the states. So you had the people at the local level through congressmen. You had the president who was elected by the nation. You had senators that were elected by the states. So you had all these different levels represented, and they were able to kind of counterbalance each other. So you kind of have this avoidance of some of the pitfalls of mass democracy that they developed in other countries. So that was kind of his compromise, and there was a lot of other compromises made and a lot of good policies. One of Washington's things was he followed Hamiltonian economics, or the national system, which is actually the form of economics I favor. Basically, the national system is, I'd say, it's capitalism, but it's capitalism with tariffs to promote industrialization and to protect emerging industries. Investments in infrastructure and kind of investments that enable the freedom of movement of goods, that enable business to just function better. And I'm trying to remember what the third part is. I think it's stable money and stable access to credit. And there's been a couple things added since then. Investments in technology and research and investments in education. The idea being to just try to create fertile conditions for private industry to thrive, which I think is a pretty good compromise between, I guess, kind of outright state capitalism where the government just owns stuff and a complete free market. So I think it, generally speaking, worked pretty good. America industrialized very rapidly and became a global economic power. So you had that, which you kind of had to drive a middle, get a bunch of compromises together to work with. We had the French Revolution, which was very difficult because you had the Federalists who were very pro-British and who kind of wanted to join the war on Britain's side, but you had the Jeffersonians who really wanted to join the war on France's side. So you had this deep divide in society between, I guess, kind of radical liberals and kind of more traditional conservatives. And Washington's basic thought was America was an emerging country. It was growing rapidly, but it wasn't ready to take part in a global world war. And whichever side they took, if they took France's side, then they'd lose all their trade with Britain, which they were entirely dependent upon. But if they took Britain's side, then they'd have to face down France, which was less of an issue, but it was more unpopular. The people were generally more pro-French. So Washington kind of steered a middle ground. America became an armed neutral country that would trade with everyone, but was willing to defend its borders if attacked. So that was basically America's position during the war. And it served them very well. They didn't suffer the kind of devastation most of Europe suffered, and it enabled them to keep growing. But it was very difficult, and it was kind of steering this middle ground. And Washington kind of continued to do that throughout his time in office, to try and balance the kind of the extreme Republicans versus kind of the more conservative aspects. And I think it's important to note, once again, with regards to the monarchy, I don't think Washington personally could have done it. I don't think that without his force of character and the general respect, the monarchy would have survived his death. It could have gotten very nasty. It could have led to another French Revolution, and God knows where that could have gone. America didn't need another revolution. Who knew what would come out of it? Would America have had a Jacobin regime or something? So I think Washington basically, he tried to make the president a revered position. He tried to make it kind of a sacred position, but one that was kind of approachable. It's like the title was, and he was initially offered the title Your Majesty or Your Highness, but he just said, just call me Mr. President. The president had all kinds of ceremonial powers, but he was also kind of accessible to the people. And I think ultimately the form of government he developed very suited America, because America is just a different society. While there is kind of a class system in America, it's not as rigid as Britain. There's always been this American attitude that if you work hard and you're smart and you make the right decisions, then you too can go from being, like in the case of J.D. Rockefeller, the son of a snake oil salesman, to become the richest man on earth. That's just kind of how America works. So you can't have kind of a monarchy and kind of the rigid class structure of Great Britain. But what he developed, generally speaking, worked out pretty well for a long time. I mean, we had the Civil War, but by and large, America had more freedom, lower taxes, and a more prosperous society than most of the world, up to and including, to be honest, the present day. Some other things where Washington kind of had to deal with was he was personally against slavery, but he owned slaves, and he didn't pursue anti-slavery policies while in office. He passed some bills to limit American participation in the slave trade, but once again, you have to understand, eventually the issue of slavery would cause the Civil War. So it was understandable for him to be very kind of apprehensive about it. His personal view was that slavery should be gradually phased out in stages with compensation to slave owners, which is actually my position. I don't think you could just outright in a country like America abolish it overnight. I mean, you can abolish it in a country like Britain where there weren't many slaves and it doesn't really matter. Even then, though, I think it should be compensated. Otherwise, it creates a lot of social rifts, and it's not really fair because it's retroactive punishment, which goes against common law. So Washington actually manumitted, he emancipated his slaves upon the death of his wife. Why it wasn't on his death was he wanted them to continue to serve his wife, and they were intermarried with his wife's slaves. He also provided that I think actually he sold a lot of his western territories to raise some capital so that when he died and his wife died, the slaves would be well taken after. The older slaves who couldn't work anymore were provided with pensions, and the younger slaves, they paid for them to learn a trade or gave them some money to buy a plot of land to farm on. So I think it was very generous. While I'm kind of a racialist, I don't like slavery. Slavery to me is an objective evil. Just because you don't want other foreigners in your country doesn't mean you support something as evil and inhumane as slavery. But generally speaking, he was a good master, and he, I think, did right by his slaves upon his death. So it's just kind of Washington had to chart the middle ground in a time where there was deep divisions in American society, where people were yelling at him from all sides. And he tried to kind of create a lot of new traditions. He tried to create a revered kind of apolitical president who just governed who was a monarch in all but name, I guess kind of like Lord Protector was under Oliver Cromwell. He tried to balance the deep desires for strong federal government versus strong state governments. And ultimately, he built, in my view, a great nation that is kind of a combination of different European peoples taking the best of them. And I think regardless how you feel about Washington, I think he was a great man, and I have a lot of affection for him. And I think he really kind of, just to an extent like Napoleon, did the best that he could and did a very good job considering he had to navigate the waters of an extremely turbulent time. So that's my character profile of George Washington. I hope you enjoyed it. This is Argent. I'll talk to you guys later.